The scream that ripped through the dusty afternoon air of Newton, Kansas, made every muscle in Donovan Yates's body tense like a mountain cat ready to spring. It was September 1876, and the small frontier town buzzed with the usual chaos of cattle drovers, farmers, and merchants hawking their wares along Main Street. Donovan had come down from his cabin in the Flint Hills for supplies, a trip he made only when absolutely necessary, preferring the solitude of the wilderness to the noise and complications of civilization. But that scream, high and desperate, cut through his instincts like a blade, and before he knew it, his long strides were carrying him toward the source. A crowd had gathered outside Pemberton's general store, and Donovan pushed through the gawking onlookers with ease. At 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle earned from years of trapping, hunting, and surviving alone in the wild, people tended to move out of his way. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite his isolated lifestyle. He wore buckskin and denim, practical clothes that had seen their share of hard use, and his hands were calloused from axe handles and rifle stocks. In the center of the commotion stood a young woman, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. She clutched a small leather purse in one hand and pointed an accusing finger at the portly merchant who stood in the doorway of his establishment, his expression a mixture of false indignation and poorly concealed guilt. "You counted out $8 in front of me, and I gave you a $10 gold piece," the woman said, her voice shaking but determined. "You owe me $2 change, Mr. Pemberton." "Now, miss, I do not appreciate being called a thief in front of my customers," Pemberton said, his jowls quivering with theatrical outrage. "I gave you your change, and if you were too addled to count it properly, that is hardly my fault." The woman's dark eyes flashed with fury, and Donovan found himself transfixed by her spirit. She was small, probably not more than 5 feet 3 inches, with auburn hair pinned up in a practical style that was already coming loose in her agitation. Her dress was simple but clean, the kind worn by respectable working women, and her hands bore the telltale roughness of someone who knew hard labor. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, and everything about her suggested she was alone and vulnerable in this rough town. "I was not addled," she said through gritted teeth. "I counted every coin, and you shorted me. $2 is half a week's wages for me, and I will not let you steal it." Some of the men in the crowd snickered, and Donovan felt his jaw tighten. He had seen this game played before. Pemberton was known for his sharp dealings, but he was careful to choose victims who had no recourse, usually women alone or drifters passing through. The local law turned a blind eye as long as Pemberton kept the town council happy with generous donations and political support. "Miss, I think you had best move along before you embarrass yourself further," Pemberton said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "I run a respectable business here, and I will not have hysterical women making false accusations." Donovan had intended to simply observe, to assess the situation, before deciding whether to involve himself. He had learned long ago that civilization and its petty corruptions were best avoided. But when he saw the merchant's hand move toward the woman, as if to physically remove her from his establishment, something primal and protective roared to life in his chest. "The lady says you owe her $2. Donovan's voice was deep and carried the quiet authority of a man who rarely needed to raise it. The crowd parted further, and suddenly the merchant found himself face to face with a man who made him look like a child by comparison. Pemberton's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a sickly pale. "This is none of your concern, Yates. This is between me and the customer." "You just told her to move along, which suggests the business transaction is complete," Donovan said, taking a step closer. "But she claims you still owe her money. So either you made an honest mistake, in which case you will be happy to correct it, or you are trying to cheat her. Which is it?" The merchant's eyes darted around, looking for support, but none of the other townspeople seemed eager to involve themselves now that Donovan had entered the situation. Everyone knew the mountain man, though few could claim to know him well. He came to town perhaps once every 2 months, traded fairly, paid in cash or furs, and never caused trouble. But there were stories about him, whispered tales of the things he had done before settling in the Flint Hills, of the way he could track anything that moved and shoot the eye out of a hawk at 100 yards. "I do not appreciate your interference," Pemberton blustered. "The girl is mistaken, and that is all there is to it." Donovan looked at the young woman, really looked at her, and saw intelligence and determination in those dark eyes, along with a thread of fear she was trying desperately to hide. "Did you count out your change, miss?" "I did, sir," she said, her voice steadier now that someone was listening. "He gave me 8 coins when he should have given me 10. I counted them twice before I even left the counter." "She is lying," Pemberton said quickly. "She is just a laundress trying to cheat an honest merchant." "I never told you I was a laundress," the woman said sharply, and Donovan saw the merchant realize his mistake. The fact that Pemberton knew her occupation suggested he had deliberately chosen her as a victim, someone without status or protection in the community. Donovan turned back to the merchant, and this time he let some of the wildness show in his eyes, the part of him that was more comfortable among wolves than men. "I think you should check your till, Pemberton. Maybe those $2 are still sitting there, and you just forgot you did not give them to her." "I will not be bullied," Pemberton said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No one is bullying anyone," Donovan said quietly. "I'm simply suggesting you double-check your count. Mistakes happen. If you find those $2, you can give them to the lady with an apology, and we can all go about our day. If you do not find them, then I suppose the lady will have to accept she was mistaken." It was a face-saving compromise, and they both knew it. Pemberton would have to surrender the money, but he could claim it was an honest error rather than deliberate theft. For a long moment, the merchant stood frozen, weighing his options. Then he seemed to deflate slightly and turned back into his store, muttering under his breath. The crowd began to disperse, the entertainment apparently over. Donovan remained where he was, and the young woman looked up at him with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and wariness. "Thank you," she said softly. "I did not think anyone would believe me." "Most people would rather not get involved," Donovan said. "It is easier to look the other way." "But you did not." "No, madam, I did not." Pemberton emerged from the store, his face red with suppressed rage. He thrust out his hand, which contained $2 silver. "It seems there was a miscount," he said stiffly. "My apologies for the confusion." The woman took the coins, her fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Pemberton." The merchant shot Donovan a look of pure venom before retreating into his store and slamming the door. The young woman tucked the money carefully into her purse and looked up at her unlikely champion. "I am Julia Foster," she said, extending her hand, "and I am truly grateful for your help, Mr. Donovan Yates," he said, taking her small hand in his much larger one. Her skin was soft despite the calluses, and he was careful not to squeeze too hard. "No need for thanks, Miss Foster. Pemberton has been playing that game too long." "Well, I doubt he will try it with me again," Julia said with a slight smile that transformed her entire face. "Not with you glowering at him like that." Donovan felt an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. "I was not glowering." "You absolutely were," Julia said. "I thought he might faint right there on the boardwalk." They stood there for a moment, an awkward silence stretching between them. Donovan suddenly realized he was still holding her hand and released it quickly, feeling heat rise in his face beneath his beard. He was not accustomed to the company of women, especially not pretty ones who looked at him like he was something other than a wild animal that wandered in from the hills. "Do you live in town, Miss Foster?" he asked, more to fill the silence than out of genuine curiosity. "I do," she said. "I have a small room at Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house on the east side. I work as a laundress and seamstress." Donovan nodded. It was honest work, if poorly paid. Newton had grown rapidly with the cattle trade, but it was still a rough town, and a woman alone had few options for respectable employment. "Well, I should let you get on with your day," he said, already looking for an escape route. The interaction had stirred up feelings he had spent years bearing, and he was suddenly eager to return to the uncomplicated solitude of his cabin. But Julia Foster was looking at the sky, where dark clouds were beginning to gather on the western horizon. "I need to get home before the rain starts," she said, more to herself than to him. "I have laundry drying on the line." As if to emphasize her point, a gust of wind swept down Main Street, carrying the smell of approaching rain and kicking up dust devils. September storms on the Kansas plains could be fierce, and Donovan could read the signs as well as any plainsman. They had perhaps half an hour before the deluge hit. "Where is Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house?" he asked. "About a mile east, past the stockyards," Julia said, gathering her skirts in preparation to hurry. "I should go." A mile, past the stockyards where the drovers and rougher elements congregated. After dark, it would be dangerous for a woman alone, but even now, with the confrontation she had just had with Pemberton, it seemed unwise to let her walk unescorted. The merchant had connections, and vindictive men had long memories. "I will walk with you," Donovan said before he could think better of it. Julia looked surprised. "That is kind, Mr. Yates, but surely you have your own business to attend to." "Nothing that cannot wait," he said, which was not entirely true. He had a list of supplies to purchase, but the general store was now closed to him thanks to his interference, and the mercantile would not open for another hour. "Besides, it looks like rain, and I would feel better knowing you got home safely." For a moment, he thought she might refuse out of propriety. A respectable woman did not walk through town with a strange man, even in broad daylight, but Julia Foster apparently had a practical streak that outweighed social niceties, because she nodded and adjusted her shawl. "Then I accept, with thanks," she said, "though I suspect you have already done more than enough for me today." They set off down Main Street, Donovan shortening his stride to match her smaller steps. The town was busy with afternoon commerce, and they drew curious looks from passers-by. Donovan ignored them, his attention focused on their surroundings and potential threats. Old habits died hard, and years of living on constant alert in the wilderness had taught him to always watch the shadows. "Have you lived in the Flint Hills long, Mr. Yates?" Julia asked as they walked, clearly trying to make conversation. 4 years, Donovan said. "I built a cabin up in the hills about 15 miles north of town." "That must be lonely." "I prefer it that way." Julia glanced up at him, her expression thoughtful. "I cannot imagine choosing to be alone like that. I grew up with 3 sisters and 2 brothers. Our house was always full of noise and chaos." "That sounds exhausting." She laughed, a bright sound that seemed to lighten the gathering gloom of the approaching storm. "It was, sometimes. But it was also wonderful. Do you have family, Mr. Yates?" The question, innocent as it was, hit him like a physical blow. Donovan's jaw tightened, and he stared straight ahead, unwilling to meet her eyes. Not anymore. Julia must have heard something in his voice because she did not press the issue. They walked in silence for a while, passing the bank and the saloons and the smaller shops that lined the main thoroughfare. When they reached the stockyards, the smell of cattle and manure was nearly overwhelming, and several drovers called out crude comments to Julia as they passed. Donovan did not break stride, but he did shift slightly closer to Julia, using his bulk to shield her from view. One of the drovers, drunker or more stupid than his companions, stepped into their path. "Hey there, pretty lady," the man said, his words slurred. "Why do not you come have a drink with me instead of walking around with that mountain ape?" Donovan stopped, and something in his stillness made the drover take an involuntary step backward. "You should move," Donovan said quietly. "Or what?" the drover blustered, but his hand dropped to the gun at his hip. "Or I will move you, and you will not like how I do it." They stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills, while Julia clutched Donovan's arm. He could feel her trembling, whether from fear or anger, he could not tell. Finally, one of the other drovers called out, "Let them be, Pete. That is Donovan Yates. He killed a grizzly bear with just a knife 2 winters back." The story was not entirely accurate, but Donovan had learned not to correct such tales. Reputation was often more effective than violence. The drover named Pete looked between Donovan and his friends, then apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor. He stepped aside with a muttered curse. Donovan guided Julia past the confrontation without another word. They had gone perhaps 50 yards before she spoke again. "Did you really kill a grizzly bear with a knife?" "It was a black bear, and I used my rifle first. The knife was only after it had already been shot 3 times and was dying." "That still seems rather impressive." "It was necessary. The bear was raiding my winter stores." They turned onto a smaller road that led away from the main part of town, passing modest houses and vegetable gardens. The wind was picking up now, and the first fat raindrops began to spatter against the dusty road. Julia picked up her pace, and Donovan matched her stride for stride. "That is Mrs. Caldwell's house," Julia said, pointing to a 2-story structure that had seen better days but was clean and well maintained. The laundry lines are in back. Sure enough, several clotheslines stretched across the backyard, heavy with sheets and clothing that whipped in the wind. Julia hurried through the side gate, and without being asked, Donovan began helping her gather the drying laundry. His large hands were surprisingly deft as he unpinned sheets and folded them roughly, passing them to Julia, who added them to the large basket she had produced from the back porch. The rain began in earnest just as they pulled down the last garment. Julia grabbed the basket and ran for the cover of the porch, laughing as the rain soaked through her dress and loosened the last of her pinned-up hair. Donovan followed more slowly, already drenched to the skin, his long hair plastered to his head and shoulders. "Oh, no," Julia said, looking at his soaked clothes with dismay. "Mr. Yates, I'm so sorry. You're absolutely drenched because of me." Donovan shrugged, water running from his buckskin shirt in rivulets. "I have been wetter. Still, you should come inside and dry off by the fire. Mrs. Caldwell will not mind, especially once I explain how you helped me." The invitation hung in the air between them. Donovan knew he should refuse, should make his excuses and head back to town to find shelter and supplies. But Julia was looking at him with those dark eyes, her hair hanging in damp curls around her face, and he found himself nodding before he could think better of it. Mrs. Caldwell turned out to be a widow in her 60s, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. She took in Donovan's appearance with a single sweeping glance and seemed to come to some conclusion that made her nod with satisfaction. "Julia, get the man a towel and put on some coffee," she said briskly. "We cannot have him catching his death after being gentleman enough to see you home safely." The boarding house was modest but comfortable, with worn furniture that was clean and well cared for. Donovan stood awkwardly by the fire, trying not to drip too much on the rug, while Julia brought him a towel and then disappeared to change out of her own wet clothes. "So you are the mountain man," Mrs. Caldwell said, settling into a rocking chair and fixing him with an assessing stare. "Julia told me what you did for her at Pemberton's store. That was well done." "Anyone would have done the same," Donovan said. "No, they would not have, and we both know it." Mrs. Caldwell's expression softened slightly. "Julia is a good girl. Lost her family to cholera 3 years ago when she was just 19. Came out here from Missouri thinking to find work and start fresh. She's had a hard time of it, trying to make ends meet alone." Donovan did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He dried his hair and beard, very aware of the impropriety of being alone with 2 women in their home, even with the landlady as chaperone. But the rain was coming down in sheets now, drumming against the roof and windows, and there was no question of leaving until it let up. Julia returned wearing a simple dark blue dress, her hair braided and pinned up properly. She carried a tray with coffee and what looked like bread and butter, setting it on the small table near the fire. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, pouring coffee into mismatched cups. "It is not much, but you are welcome to share our supper." "I cannot take your food," Donovan said automatically. "It is just bread and butter," Julia said with a smile, "and some cheese if you would like it. Please, Mr. Yates, you have done me a great service today. At least let me offer you a meal." They sat together by the fire, the storm raging outside, while warmth and the smell of coffee filled the small room. Mrs. Caldwell excused herself after a few minutes, claiming tiredness, but leaving the door to the parlor conspicuously open for propriety's sake. Donovan suspected she was giving them privacy while still maintaining respectability. "Tell me about your cabin in the hills," Julia said, tucking her feet up under her skirts as she settled into the chair. "What is it like, living so far from everyone?" Donovan considered the question. No one had asked him that before. Most people assumed his isolation was either a punishment or a penance, and neither wanted nor cared to understand. "Peaceful," he said finally. "I have a good spring nearby for water, and the hunting is excellent. I trap beaver and fox, sell the pelts when I come to town. In the summer, there are wild berries and honey if you know where to look. Winter can be hard, but I have learned to prepare for it. Do you ever get lonely?" The question was asked softly, without judgment, and Donovan found himself wanting to answer honestly. "Sometimes. But loneliness is better than the alternative." "What alternative is that?" "Losing people you care about." Julia was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee. "I understand that," she said finally. "After my family died, I thought I would die too, from the grief of it. Everything reminded me of them, Every sunrise my father would never see, every meal my mother would never cook, every joke my brothers would never tell. It was unbearable. How did you survive it? Donovan asked, genuinely curious. I did not have a choice, Julia said simply. I had no money, no other family to turn to. So I put one foot in front of the other day after day until eventually the steps got easier. I still miss them terribly, but I have learned to live with the grief rather than letting it consume me. That takes courage. So does choosing to live alone in the wilderness, Julia said, looking at him with those perceptive eyes. What are you running from, Donovan Yates? The use of his first name, so casual and natural, did something strange to his chest. He stared into his coffee cup, watching the dark liquid swirl. I had a wife, he said, the words coming slowly, painfully, and a daughter. They died 6 years ago during a Comanche raid on our settlement in Texas. I was out hunting. By the time I got back, it was over. I buried them both under a cottonwood tree. Julia drew in a sharp breath, but she did not offer empty platitudes or false comfort. Instead, she simply reached out and placed her hand over his, her touch warm and solid and real. I'm so sorry, she said quietly. That is a terrible burden to carry alone. I could not save them, Donovan said, and he was horrified to hear his voice crack slightly. I was supposed to protect them, and I failed. You were not there. It was not your fault. I should have been there. Then you would be dead too, and they would still be gone. Julia squeezed his hand gently. You cannot change the past, Donovan. You can only choose how you live with it. They sat there in silence, hands joined, while the storm raged outside and the fire crackled on the hearth. Donovan could not remember the last time he had touched another person with gentleness, the last time someone had offered comfort without expecting anything in return. It terrified him and warmed him in equal measure. The rain is letting up, he said finally, though it was barely true. A few minutes before, it had been a deluge, and now it was merely a heavy downpour, but he needed an excuse to leave before he said or did something foolish. Julia seemed to understand. She withdrew her hand, though not unkindly, and stood to walk him to the door. Thank you again for everything you did today, she said, for standing up to Pemberton, for walking me home, for listening. You are welcome, Miss Foster. Julia, she said, after everything we have shared today, I think you can call me Julia. Julia, he repeated, liking the way her name felt in his mouth. I'm glad I was there to help. He retrieved his damp hat from the peg by the door and settled it on his head. The rain was still falling, but it was nothing compared to the storm that had just passed. As he stepped onto the porch, Julia called out after him, Will you come back to visit, Donovan? I would like to see you again. He turned, and the hope in her face was almost painful to look at. He should say no. He should tell her that he was not fit company for anyone, that he had nothing to offer but ghosts and guilt, but instead, he found himself nodding. I will be back in town in 2 weeks for supplies. Maybe I could stop by. I would like that, Julia said, and her smile was like sunrise breaking over the prairie. Donovan walked back through the rain-soaked streets of Newton, his mind churning with thoughts he had not allowed himself to have in years. He found lodging at a small inn and spent a restless night staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the memory of Julia's hand in his, the sound of her laugh, the understanding in her eyes when he had finally spoken about his lost family. The next morning, he purchased his supplies from the mercantile, paying for everything with beaver pelts that were pronounced to be of excellent quality. The clerk mentioned that Pemberton had been spreading rumors about Julia Foster being a thief and a troublemaker, trying to salvage his reputation after the confrontation. Donovan made it a point to stop by the newspaper office and speak with the editor, a man named Harrison who had a reputation for honest reporting. I would appreciate it if you would print the truth about what happened yesterday, Donovan said, placing a $5 gold piece on the editor's desk. Miss Foster was cheated, and she had the courage to stand up for herself. The town should know that. Harrison looked at the gold piece, then at Donovan's face, and seemed to make a calculation. I will print it, he said, though it will not make me popular with certain merchants. Sometimes doing the right thing is not popular, Donovan said. He left Newton late that morning, his pack horse loaded with supplies, and rode north toward the Flint Hills. The journey took the better part of the day, and by the time he reached his cabin, The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold. The familiar sight of his home, small and sturdy with smoke curling from the chimney thanks to the banked coals he always left burning, should have brought him peace. Instead, for the first time in 4 years, it felt empty and lonely. The days that followed were strange ones for Donovan. He went about his usual routines, checking his trap lines, hunting for meat to smoke and preserve for winter, cutting firewood and making repairs to his cabin and outbuildings. But his mind kept drifting back to Newton, to a small woman with dark eyes and auburn hair who had looked at him like he was a man worth knowing rather than a beast worth avoiding. He found himself counting the days until his next trip to town, a fact that both amused and alarmed him. He was behaving like a green youth with his first infatuation, not a man of 32 who had already loved and lost everything that mattered. But there was something about Julia Foster that had burrowed under his skin and taken root, and try as he might, he could not shake her loose. When the 2 weeks had passed, Donovan made the journey to Newton with more anticipation than he cared to admit. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon, when the town was bustling with farmers and ranchers come to trade and socialize. He completed his business at the Mercantile first, purchasing flour and coffee and other necessities, then made his way to Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house. Julia was hanging laundry in the backyard when he arrived, and the sight of her in a simple cotton dress with her sleeves rolled up made his breath catch. She looked up as he approached, and her face transformed with a smile that made all the nervous anticipation worthwhile. "Donovan," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "I was hoping you would come." "I said I would," he replied, suddenly feeling awkward and tongue-tied. "I know, but men do not always keep their promises to women like me." "What kind of woman is that?" "The kind without family or protection or social standing," Julia said matter-of-factly. "The kind that is easy to forget or ignore." "I do not think anyone could forget you," Donovan said, and was rewarded with a blush that colored her cheeks. They talked while she finished hanging the laundry, an easy conversation that felt natural despite the 2 weeks that had passed. Julia told him about her work, about the difficult customers and the kind ones, about her hopes to eventually save enough money to open her own dress shop. Donovan found himself telling her about the wilderness, about the way the hills looked in the early morning mist, about the family of deer that came to drink from his spring every evening at dusk. "It sounds beautiful," Julia said wistfully. "I have never been anywhere but towns and cities. I cannot imagine what it must be like to see such wild places." "Maybe I could show you someday," Donovan said before he could think better of it. Julia looked up at him, surprise and something else flickering across her face. "I would like that," she said softly. From that day forward, Donovan found reasons to come to Newton more frequently. His twice-monthly supply runs became weekly visits, and he began to time his arrivals for Saturday afternoons when Julia had finished most of her work for the day. They would walk together through town or sit on Mrs. Caldwell's porch, talking about everything and nothing. The townspeople began to notice, and gossip started to spread. Some of it was kind, remarking on what a fine couple they made. Some of it was less charitable, with certain individuals suggesting that a wild mountain man was hardly appropriate company for a respectable young woman. But Julia ignored the talk with the same practical determination she applied to everything else, and Donovan found that he cared less about public opinion than he did about the way she smiled when she saw him. October arrived with cool nights and brilliant autumn colors painting the prairie grasses gold and russet. Donovan found himself thinking more and more about what it would mean to let someone back into his heart, to risk the devastating loss that came with loving another person. The fear was real and visceral, but so was the loneliness that he had finally admitted to himself after years of denial. One Saturday in mid-October, he arrived at the boarding house to find Julia in tears. Mrs. Caldwell met him at the door, her expression grim. "That bastard Pemberton has been spreading lies about her," the older woman said without preamble. "Telling people that Julia is a loose woman who has been entertaining men in her room. Several of her best customers have withdrawn their business, and she is worried about making rent this month." Fury, white-hot and immediate, surged through Donovan's chest. "Where is she?" "In her room, top of the stairs, second door on the left." Donovan took the stairs 2 at a time, his boots thundering on the wooden steps. He knocked once, softly, and heard Julia's voice, thick with tears, tell him to come in. Her room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a dresser, and a table by the window where she did her sewing. Julia sat on the bed, her face blotchy from crying, and the sight of her distress made Donovan want to tear something apart with his bare hands. "He's ruining my reputation," Julia said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I've worked so hard to build a respectable life here, and he is destroying it because I dared to stand up to him." Donovan crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. They were cold and trembling, and he rubbed them gently, trying to impart warmth and comfort. "I will fix this," he said, his voice low and intense. "I promise you, Julia. I will make this right." "How?" "You cannot fight gossip with fists." "No, but I can fight it with truth and consequence." He stood, his mind already working through possibilities. Pemberton was a coward and a bully, the kind of man who only felt powerful when targeting those weaker than himself. But he was also a businessman, and that meant he was vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with physical violence. "What are you going to do?" Julia asked, alarm creeping into her voice. "Nothing foolish," Donovan assured her, "but Pemberton is going to learn that there are consequences for his actions." He left the boarding house and headed directly to the newspaper office. Harrison was there, working on the next edition, and he looked up with interest when Donovan entered. "I need you to run a story," Donovan said, "about Pemberton and his business practices. I can provide you with names of at least 6 other people he has cheated in the last year." Harrison leaned back in his chair. "That is a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" "I have witnesses, and I am willing to bet if you start asking questions, more people will come forward. The only reason Pemberton has gotten away with it for so long is because he targets people who are afraid to speak up." "And you think Julia Foster's situation is connected?" "I know it is. He's spreading lies about her because she dared to confront him publicly. It is retaliation, pure and simple." Harrison considered this, tapping his pencil against the desk. "If I run this story, it will cause trouble. Pemberton has friends on the town council." "Are you a newspaper man or a politician?" Donovan asked bluntly. Harrison grinned. "Point taken. I will start investigating. But I will need those names, and I will need people willing to go on record." Donovan spent the next week gathering information. He spoke to the drover who had been shorted on a payment for cattle, the widow who had been overcharged for flour, the farmer who had purchased seed that turned out to be half chaff. Some were reluctant to speak up, but others, emboldened by the mountain man's determination and the promise of the newspaper's support, agreed to tell their stories. Harrison published the article on Saturday morning, and by noon, the town was in an uproar. Pemberton appeared at the newspaper office, red-faced and threatening legal action, but Harrison stood his ground. When Pemberton tried to physically intimidate the editor, Donovan materialized from the shadows like a vengeful spirit, and the merchant fled. The town council called an emergency meeting that evening. Donovan attended, sitting in the back of the room with his arms crossed and his expression dark. When Pemberton tried to deny the accusations, 3 of the people Donovan had interviewed stood up and told their stories. The council, faced with overwhelming evidence and the threat of losing public support, voted to revoke Pemberton's business license pending a full investigation. Donovan left the meeting and went directly to Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house. Julia met him at the door, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I heard what happened," she said. "Donovan, what did you do?" "I told you I would make it right," he said simply. Julia looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something that shocked them both. She threw her arms around his neck and hugged him with all her strength. Donovan stood frozen for a heartbeat, then slowly, carefully, he wrapped his arms around her small frame and held her close. She smelled like soap and lavender, and she fit against him like she had been made to be there. He rested his cheek against the top of her head and closed his eyes, feeling something tight and painful in his chest finally begin to loosen. "Thank you," Julia whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you for believing me. Thank you for protecting me." "Always," Donovan heard himself say, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. They stood there on the porch, holding each other, while the autumn wind whispered through the eaves and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. When they finally pulled apart, Julia looked up at him with shining eyes. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked. "Mrs. Caldwell is making stew, and there is more than enough." Donovan agreed, and they spent the evening together, talking and laughing while Mrs. Caldwell watched with knowing eyes. When it was time for him to leave, Julia walked him to the gate. "When will I see you again?" she asked. "I will be back in 3 days," Donovan said. "I need to check my trap lines, but then I will come back." "I will be waiting." The 3 days felt like an eternity. Donovan found himself working with frantic energy, rushing through his chores so he could return to Newton. His trap lines were productive, yielding several prime pelts that would fetch good prices, but his heart was not in the work. His heart, he was beginning to realize, was in a small boarding house with a woman who had somehow managed to slip past all his carefully constructed defenses. When he returned to Newton, it was to find that Julia's reputation had been largely restored. Several of her former customers had returned, offering apologies for believing the rumors. Pemberton's store had been shut down entirely, and the merchant had left town in disgrace. The whole affair had created a certain amount of notoriety for Julia, but it was the good kind, the kind that painted her as a brave young woman who had stood up to corruption. "People keep telling me how courageous I was," Julia said as they walked along the banks of the creek that ran south of town. "But I did not feel courageous at all. I was terrified." "Courage is not the absence of fear," Donovan said. "It is acting despite the fear. You were very brave, Julia." They had stopped beneath a stand of cottonwood trees, their leaves golden in the late afternoon sun. Julia turned to face him, and there was something in her expression that made Donovan's heart pound. "I have been thinking," she said carefully, "about what I want from my life, what would make me truly happy." "And what is that?" "I thought it was independence, a business of my own, security, respectability. And those things are important. But they are not everything. What else is there?" Julia took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. "I want what my parents had. A partnership. Someone to share my life with, to laugh with, to build something with. I want love, Donovan. And I think I might be falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, brave and terrifying and beautiful. Donovan stood frozen, his mind and heart at war. The fear was there, immediate and overwhelming, whispering that he could not survive losing someone again. But stronger than the fear was something else, something that had been growing steadily over the past weeks. "I am broken," he said finally, his voice rough. "I have spent 6 years running from ghosts. I do not know if I can be what you need." "I am not asking you to be perfect," Julia said, stepping closer. "I am asking you to be honest, to try. Do you have feelings for me, Donovan?" He looked down at her, at the hope and vulnerability in her face, and knew he could not lie. "Yes," he said. "God help me. Yes. I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you standing up to Pemberton, all fire and determination. You terrify me, Julia Foster." "Why?" "Because caring about you means risking everything. It means opening myself up to loss again, and I do not know if I am strong enough to survive it." Julia reached up and cupped his face in her small hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "No one is promised tomorrow, Donovan. We could spend our whole lives afraid of loss, or we could choose to live and love and take the risk. I choose to risk it. The question is, will you?" For a long moment, Donovan stood paralyzed by fear and longing. Then, slowly, he bent his head and kissed her. It was tentative at first, questioning, but Julia responded with a soft sound of encouragement and wound her arms around his neck. The kiss deepened, becoming something desperate and hungry, 6 years of loneliness and grief pouring out of Donovan like water from a burst dam. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Julia was smiling. "Was that a yes?" "That was a yes," Donovan said, and then he laughed, the sound rusty and unpracticed but genuine. "I'm going to try, Julia. I cannot promise I will not be difficult or that I will always know what to do, but I promise I will try. That is all I ask." They walked back to town hand in hand, and it felt like a promise, like the first step on a new path. Mrs. Caldwell took one look at their joined hands and smiled, nodding her approval. The courtship that followed was unconventional by the standards of the day, but it felt right to both of them. Donovan began making the trip to Newton twice a week, spending every Saturday and Wednesday in Julia's company. They took long walks together, exploring the countryside around town. Donovan taught Julia to identify animal tracks and edible plants, while she shared stories of her family and her dreams for the future. In November, Donovan invited Julia to see his cabin. Mrs. Caldwell agreed to chaperone, and the three of them made the journey north into the Flint Hills on a crisp autumn day. Julia was enchanted by the wilderness, exclaiming over the rolling hills and the vast sky and the way the prairie grasses rippled like waves in the wind. The cabin, when they reached it, was small but sturdy, built of logs that Donovan had cut and fit himself. It had a main room with a fireplace, a small loft for sleeping, and a lean-to that served as storage and stable. It was sparse and practical, but Julia walked through it with wonder, running her hands over the smooth wood and the handmade furniture. "You built all this yourself?" she asked. "Over the course of 2 years," Donovan said. "It kept me busy, gave me something to focus on besides grief." "It is wonderful," Julia said, and she meant it. "I can see why you love it here. It is so peaceful." They spent the day exploring, with Donovan showing her the spring and the deer trail and the clearing where he had planted a small garden. Mrs. Caldwell made dinner over the fire, and they ate together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. "I could be happy here," Julia said quietly as they stood on the porch, watching the stars emerge. "If you wanted me to be." Donovan looked at her, this small, fierce woman who had somehow saved him from himself, and felt his heart swell with an emotion he thought he had lost forever. "I want you to be happy, Julia. Whether that is here or in town or anywhere else, I just want to be wherever you are." Winter came early that year, with the first snow falling in late November. Donovan spent more time in town, unwilling to risk being snowed in and separated from Julia for weeks at a time. He rented a room at the boarding house just down the hall from Julia's and helped Mrs. Caldwell with repairs and heavy work in exchange for reduced rent. The arrangement scandalized some of the more conservative townspeople, but it also had an unexpected benefit. Other boarders began to move in, drawn by the increased safety and security of having a man like Donovan on the premises. By December, the boarding house was full, and Mrs. Caldwell was able to lower everyone's rent while still making a comfortable profit. Christmas arrived, and with it came a fierce blizzard that shut down the town for 3 days. Trapped inside by the howling wind and driving snow, the boarders became a makeshift family. They sang carols and told stories and shared what food they had. Donovan carved small toys for the children in the house and helped reinforce the roof when the weight of the snow threatened to collapse it. On Christmas Eve, as the wind finally began to die down, Donovan asked Julia to walk with him to the parlor. The other boarders had retired to their rooms, giving them a rare moment of privacy. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with strings of popcorn and paper ornaments, and a fire crackled merrily in the hearth. "I have something for you," Donovan said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small carved wooden box, simple but beautifully made, and handed it to Julia. She opened it carefully, and her breath caught. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a gold ring. It was not fancy or elaborate, just a simple band, but it gleamed in the firelight. "It was my grandmother's," Donovan said, his voice low and intense. "The only thing I have left from my life before. I have been carrying it with me for years, not sure what to do with it. But I know now. Julia Foster, I love you. I love your courage and your kindness, and the way you make me want to be a better man. Will you marry me?" Julia looked up at him with tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Donovan, I will marry you. I love you so much." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all these years for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, pouring all his love and hope and promise into that single moment. They were married in January in a small ceremony at the town church. Mrs. Caldwell stood as Julia's witness, and the newspaper editor Harrison stood for Donovan. It was a simple affair with only a handful of guests, but it felt perfect and right. After the ceremony, there was a small reception at the boarding house with cake and punch and dancing. Donovan, who had not danced in years, let Julia teach him the steps, stumbling and laughing as she guided him around the parlor. Looking at her, flushed and happy and beautiful in her simple white dress, he felt a surge of gratitude so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. Thank you," he whispered as they swayed together. "Thank you for taking a chance on me." "Thank you for letting me in," Julia replied, resting her head against his chest. "Thank you for loving me." They spent their first night as husband and wife in Donovan's room at the boarding house, a fact that made Julia blush and Donovan grin. But propriety had been satisfied with the wedding, and now they were free to express the love that had been building between them for months. That night, Donovan was tender and careful, very aware of Julia's inexperience, and determined to make their first time together something beautiful rather than painful or frightening. He took his time, kissing her slowly, learning the map of her body with gentle hands. When they finally came together, Julia clung to him, gasping his name, and Donovan felt something fundamental shift in his soul. He had thought this part of his life was over, that physical intimacy was something he would never experience again. But with Julia, it felt like coming home. She was generous and responsive, meeting his passion with her own, and afterward, they lay tangled together, her head on his chest and his arms wrapped protectively around her. "I was afraid," she admitted softly. "Everyone says the first time is awful for women." "Was it?" Donovan asked, suddenly worried he had hurt her despite his best efforts. "No," Julia said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "It was wonderful. You were wonderful." They dozed together as the fire burned low, and when Donovan woke in the small hours of the morning, he lay still, savoring the weight of Julia's body against his and the sound of her soft breathing. For the first time in 6 years, the ghosts that haunted him seemed to have retreated, giving him peace. In the spring, they moved to the cabin in the Flint Hills. It was not an easy transition for Julia, who was used to the conveniences and society of town, but she adapted with the same practical determination she applied to everything. Donovan added on to the cabin, building a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen with a wood-burning stove he purchased in town. He also built a chicken coop and a small barn for the milk cow and horse they had acquired. Julia established a garden, planting vegetables and herbs, and learned to preserve food for the winter. She also continued her sewing, making clothes for both of them and taking commissions from women in town who admired her neat stitching. Twice a month, they would make the trip to Newton, selling Donovan's furs and Julia's handiwork and visiting with Mrs. Caldwell and their other friends. It was a good life, simple but satisfying. They worked hard during the day and came together in the evenings, talking and laughing and making love beneath quilts while the wind sang across the hills. Donovan taught Julia to shoot and track, wanting her to be able to protect herself if he was ever away. Julia taught Donovan to read and write more fluently, spending winter evenings with books they borrowed from the town library. Summer arrived in a blaze of heat and wildflowers, and with it came news that made Julia's face light up with joy. She was pregnant. The baby would arrive in late winter, the doctor in Newton estimated, and suddenly the cabin felt too small and too isolated. "What if something goes wrong?" Julia asked one night, her hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach. "What if you cannot get me to town in time?" The fear in her voice cut Donovan to the bone. He had already been thinking about the logistics, worrying about the same things. Winter births were dangerous in the best of circumstances, and being 15 miles from the nearest doctor added another layer of risk. "We will move to town for the winter," he said decisively. "We can rent a room at Mrs. Caldwell's boarding house, and you will be close to the doctor. After the baby is born and you are both strong enough, we can come back to the cabin." Julia looked relieved. "You would do that? Leave your home for months?" "My home is wherever you are," Donovan said simply. "You and the baby are more important than any place." They made the move in November, settling into 2 rooms on the first floor of the boarding house. Mrs. Caldwell was delighted to have them back and immediately began knitting baby clothes and offering advice. The other boarders, a rotating cast of traveling salesmen, young single women, and a few families, treated Julia like a fragile treasure, insisting she rest and refusing to let her do any heavy work. Donovan found work at the lumber yard, putting his strength to use hauling and cutting timber. It was hard physical labor, but it paid well, and he took satisfaction in being able to provide for his growing family through means other than trapping and hunting. Julia continued her sewing, though she tired more easily as her pregnancy progressed. December passed in a blur of preparation. Donovan built a cradle, carefully sanding and polishing the wood until it was smooth as silk. Julia sewed tiny gowns and blankets, her face soft with anticipation. They talked late into the night about names and hopes and fears, building dreams together. The baby came on a bitterly cold night in late February. Julia's labor started in the early evening, and by midnight she was gripping Donovan's hand so hard he thought his bones might break. The doctor was there, and Mrs. Caldwell. But it was Donovan's presence that Julia needed, his voice talking her through the pain, his strength anchoring her. When the baby finally arrived in the early hours of the morning, it was a boy, healthy and squalling with indignation at being thrust into the cold world. The doctor placed the tiny bundle in Julia's arms, and she looked up at Donovan with exhausted triumph. "We have a son," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Donovan looked at the tiny red face, at the miniature fists waving in the air, and felt something crack open in his chest. He had been so afraid, so terrified, that loving again would lead to loss. But looking at his wife and son, he knew that the risk had been worth it. Life was uncertain and fragile, but it was also beautiful and precious, and he would not trade this moment for anything. "What should we name him?" Julia asked. They had discussed names for months, unable to agree. But looking at the baby now, Donovan knew exactly what felt right. "William," he said, "after your father, William Foster Yates." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "Really? You would do that?" "Your father was a good man who raised a remarkable daughter," Donovan said. "It would be an honor to name our son after him." They stayed in town for another 2 months, giving Julia time to recover and baby William time to grow stronger. When spring finally arrived, bringing warmer weather and the first green shoots pushing through the earth, they packed up their belongings and made the journey back to the Flint Hills. The cabin felt different with a baby in it, smaller and yet more alive. William was a good baby, healthy and curious, and as the months passed, he grew strong and bright-eyed. Donovan found himself constantly amazed by the tiny milestones, the first smile, the first laugh, the first time William grabbed his father's finger with a grip that suggested he would grow to be strong like his father. Julia bloomed with motherhood, patient and loving even during the difficult nights when William would not stop crying or the exhausting days when every chore took twice as long because she had to stop and nurse or change or soothe. Donovan helped as much as he could, learning to change diapers and walk the floor with his son when Julia needed to sleep. That summer, they received visitors. A family passing through from Missouri on their way to California stopped at the cabin, desperate for water and directions. Donovan and Julia invited them to stay for supper, and the two families shared a meal and stories as the sun set over the hills. "You have a good life here," the traveling man said, looking around at the cabin and the garden and the obvious love between Donovan and Julia. "Not many people are brave enough to build something real in this wild country." "It takes work," Julia said, bouncing William on her knee. "But it is worth it." After the family left, continuing their journey west, Donovan and Julia sat on the porch together, watching the stars emerge. William slept peacefully in his cradle inside, and the night was warm and still. "Are you happy?" Donovan asked, taking Julia's hand. "Truly happy?" "More than I ever thought possible," Julia said. "When I lost my family, I thought I would never feel whole again. But you and William, this life we have built together, you have given me a new family, Donovan, a new reason to wake up every morning with joy." "You saved me," Donovan said quietly. "I was so lost before I met you, drowning in guilt and grief, but you pulled me out of the darkness and showed me that life could be good again. That love was worth the risk." "We saved each other," Julia corrected gently. "That is what love does. It makes us stronger together than we could ever be alone." The years that followed brought their share of challenges. There were harsh winters that tested their endurance, summers so hot and dry that the garden struggled, and the constant work of maintaining their homestead and raising their growing family. 2 years after William was born, Julia gave birth to twin girls, Sarah and Catherine, who kept their parents busy and exhausted in equal measure. But there were joys too, more numerous and profound than the hardships. There were lazy summer afternoons when Donovan would teach William to fish in the creek, while Julia sat on the bank with the sleeping twins. There were winter evenings when the whole family would huddle together by the fire, telling stories and singing songs while the snow piled high outside. Donovan's business expanded gradually over the years. He became known as a reliable guide for parties wanting to explore the Flint Hills, and his furs and hides were prized for their quality. Julia's sewing work grew as well, with women traveling from as far as Wichita to commission her dresses and quilts. Together, they built a life of modest prosperity, enough to be comfortable without ever becoming wealthy. When William was 10, Donovan took him on his first extended hunting trip, just the two of them camping in the hills for a week. It was a chance to teach his son the skills he would need to survive in this wild country, but it was also a chance to talk, man to man, about life and responsibility and what it meant to be good. "Your mother is the bravest person I have ever known," Donovan told William as they sat by the campfire one night. "She took a chance on a broken man and loved me back to wholeness. That kind of courage, that kind of faith, those are the qualities that make a person truly strong." "I want to be strong like you, Pa," William said, his young face serious in the firelight. "Then be kind," Donovan said. "Be honest. Stand up for people who cannot stand up for themselves. That is real strength, not just muscles and shooting skills. Your mother taught me that." They returned home to find Julia and the twins making jam from wild berries, the kitchen fragrant with sugar and summer fruit. The girls, now 8 years old and as different as night and day despite being twins, immediately demanded stories about the hunting trip, and William regaled them with probably exaggerated tales of his father's prowess. Julia caught Donovan's eye across the chaos of their children's voices, and they shared a smile of perfect understanding. This was what they had built together: a family, a home, a life filled with love and laughter and purpose. More years passed, bringing the inevitable changes that time inflicts on everyone. Donovan's hair began to gray at the temples, and Julia found laugh lines forming at the corners of her eyes. Their children grew, William shooting up to nearly his father's height, the twins becoming young ladies who helped their mother with increasingly complex sewing projects. Mrs. Caldwell passed away when William was 14, leaving her boarding house to Julia in her will. It was an unexpected gift, one that brought tears to Julia's eyes. They decided to keep the business running, hiring a manager to handle the day-to-day operations while they remained primarily at the cabin. The income from the boarding house gave them security and allowed them to start saving for their children's futures. When William was 16, he announced his intention to become a doctor. It would require years of study and significant expense, but Donovan and Julia were determined to support his dreams. They sold some of their land to a neighboring rancher, using the money to send William east to medical school. The twins, meanwhile, showed no interest in leaving the hills. Sarah proved to have her father's gift for tracking and hunting, while Catherine shared her mother's talent with needle and thread. They were inseparable, despite their differences, finishing each other's sentences and communicating in the wordless way that twins often do. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Donovan took Julia back to the place where they had first kissed, beneath the cottonwood trees by the creek. It was autumn again, the leaves golden and the air crisp with the promise of winter. "Do you remember what you said to me that day?" Donovan asked, holding both of Julia's hands in his. "You said that no one is promised tomorrow, and we could either spend our lives afraid of loss or choose to live and love and take the risk." "I remember," Julia said softly. "You were right. These 20 years with you have been the greatest gift of my life. Every morning I wake up next to you, every meal we share, every challenge we face together, it is all worth it. You are worth it." "We are worth it," Julia corrected, as she always did. "We are stronger together, remember?" "I remember." Donovan kissed her then, tender and deep, pouring 2 decades of love and gratitude into that single gesture. They stood there for a long time, holding each other beneath the cottonwoods, while the creek murmured its eternal song and the wind whispered through the golden leaves. They had both known loss and loneliness, had both been broken by grief, but they had found each other in a dusty frontier town, and together they had built something beautiful and lasting. William returned home 5 years later, a qualified doctor ready to open his own practice. He chose to settle in Newton, taking over the aging doctor, Mitchell's office, and serving the community his parents had made their own. Donovan and Julia attended the opening of his practice, bursting with pride as their son treated his first official patients. The twins both married within a year of each other. Sarah wed a rancher named Thomas, a quiet, steady man who shared her love of the outdoors. Catherine married a banker's son named James, who appreciated her artistic talents and supported her dream of opening a dress shop in Wichita. Both weddings were joyous occasions, filled with family and friends and the kind of celebration that only comes from genuine happiness. As grandchildren began to arrive, Donovan and Julia found themselves entering a new phase of life. They were no longer the young couple building a future, but rather the foundation upon which that future was being built. William's first child, a daughter they named Julia after her grandmother, was followed by Sarah's son, and then Catherine's twins, and then more, until Donovan lost count of how many grandchildren he had. The cabin in the hills, which had started as a refuge for a grieving man, had become the center of a sprawling family. On holidays and special occasions, it would fill with children and grandchildren, the noise and chaos a stark contrast to the silence that had once defined Donovan's life. "Did you ever imagine this?" Julia asked one Christmas, watching their family gathered around the table Donovan had built 40 years earlier. All of this, coming from that day in front of Pemberton's store. "Never," Donovan admitted. "I thought my life was over. I thought I had nothing left to give or receive. You proved me wrong in the best possible way." "We proved each other wrong," Julia said, taking his hand. Her fingers were gnarled now with arthritis, and his were rough and scarred from a lifetime of hard work, but they fit together perfectly. "We proved that second chances are real, that love can bloom even in the hardest soil." They grew old together, as they had always hoped to do. Donovan's body, which had been so strong for so long, began to fail him in small ways. His knees ached in the mornings, and he could no longer lift the heavy loads he once had hoisted with ease. But Julia was there, patient and loving, helping him adapt to the limitations of age. Julia's eyesight began to fail, making her cherished sewing work increasingly difficult. But Donovan was there, reading to her by the fire, describing the world outside their windows, being her eyes when hers could no longer serve. They moved into town permanently when Donovan was 72, the cabin finally too isolated and demanding for their aging bodies. William insisted they live with him and his family, but Donovan and Julia chose instead to rent a small house near the boarding house Julia still owned. They wanted their independence while still being close to family. Their golden years were peaceful ones, filled with visits from children and grandchildren, quiet evenings on the porch, and the deep contentment that comes from a life well lived. They would sit together and reminisce, telling and retelling the stories of their life together, making sure the details were preserved for future generations. On a warm spring evening, when Donovan was 78 and Julia 76, they sat together on their porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Donovan's arm was around Julia's shoulders, and her head rested against his chest, their bodies fitting together in the way that only decades of practice can achieve. "I love you," Donovan said, the words as natural as breathing after all these years. "I love you too," Julia replied. "Thank you for walking me home that day. Thank you for making everything right." "Thank you for letting me," Donovan said. "Thank you for teaching me how to live again." They sat there as the sun slowly sank below the horizon, two souls who had found each other against all odds and built a life of love and meaning. The mountain man who had been broken by loss and the laundress who had refused to be victimized had become partners, lovers, friends, and finally, the foundation of a family that would carry their legacy forward for generations. When Donovan passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, Julia held his hand and whispered her love one final time. She followed him 6 months after that, unable and unwilling to exist without her other half. They were buried side by side in the Newton Cemetery, beneath a simple headstone that read, "Donovan and Julia Yates, together in life, together in eternity." Their children and grandchildren gathered to mourn and to celebrate, sharing stories of the couple who had taught them all what real love looked like. William told his own children about the day his father saw a young woman being cheated by a merchant, how he had made it right and walked her safely home, and how that single act of integrity had changed the course of both their lives. "That is what love is," William said, his doctor's hands gentle on his daughter's shoulder. "It is seeing someone in need and choosing to help. It is making things right when the world is wrong. It is walking each other home every single day until the very end. The story of Donovan and Julia Yates became a legend in Newton, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But for those who had known them, who had seen the way they looked at each other even after 50 years of marriage, who had witnessed the family and community they built together, it was simply the truth. Two people, broken by loss and hardship, who found each other in a moment of injustice and chose love over loneliness. Two souls who proved that second chances are real, that courage can be found in the smallest acts of kindness, and that sometimes walking someone safely home is the beginning of a journey that lasts a lifetime. Their legacy lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the values they instilled and the love they demonstrated. The cabin in the Flint Hills still stood, maintained by Sarah's descendants who continued to work the land. The boarding house still operated, now run by Catherine's granddaughter. William's children and grandchildren became doctors and teachers and ranchers, spreading across Kansas and beyond, carrying the story of their grandparents with them. And on quiet spring evenings, when the wind whispered through the cottonwood trees by the creek, old-timers in Newton would swear they could still see them sometimes, a mountain man with long dark hair and a small woman with auburn curls walking hand in hand through the twilight, heading home together as they always had, as they always would. The end of their mortal story, but the beginning of their eternal one, and a reminder to everyone who heard their tale that love, real love, the kind that changes everything, can begin with a single act of courage and a choice to make things right.